Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Did Edgar Allan Poe leave a secret message for future generations to discover? I actually have two. We'll find out what these encrypted messages said on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. So this is an 1841 volume of Graham's magazine. It's a magazine that Poe started editing about March of 1841 when he's 32 years old. When Poe started there, one of the first things he did for his first issue of the magazine was publish a new kind of story. One where there's a ghastly crime, seemingly bizarre, impossible to solve, and Poe's main character, a new kind of character, solves it using his brain. This was the birth of detective fiction. This was The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And people who read it thought this was an entirely new kind of tale. And they thought Poe must be a genius for having written it. Imagine there's no such thing as a detective story. And you read all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. That's the kind of effect this had on people. In fact, generations later, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was writing his Sherlock Holmes mysteries, he said, where was the detective story before Poe breathed the breath of life into it? So now there's an expectation that Poe should write ingenious stories like this. He continued to write his terror tales, and Mask of the Red Death and The Oval Portrait appear in this magazine as well. But he also had a job to do. He was the editor. He was also writing book reviews, so there's a lot of literary criticism in here. He also wrote about topics that appealed to him. Check this out. This is autography. This is where Poe pretends that he can analyze handwriting. And there's facsimiles of different famous authors from the time, and Poe pretends that he could analyze their personality just based on their signature, but really what he's doing is just making fun of the different authors. And then there's a whole series of articles like this one, A Few Words on Secret Writing. Poe is obsessed with secret writing, or cryptograms, encoded messages, and finding different ways to encode them, whether there's a single substitution cipher, the one you all learn in school where you just replace each letter with a different letter, and then you write the message with all the replaced letters. But that's an easy one to solve. They do it on the Wheel of Fortune all the time. If you see a message, you see a letter repeated again and again, it could be an S or an E, and you just sort of fill in the letters based on the most common letters you see. And then if you only see something a few times, it might be something Q or Z that's a little bit more rare. But there's a lot more difficult ciphers. There's things like the Caesar cipher, or there's ciphers that don't just replace letters, they rearrange them, like the rail fence cipher. Poe even found different ways to rearrange letters in his poems so that he could hide messages in them. Think about his poem, A Valentine, where he hid the name Frances Sargent Osgood, who is the secret subject of the poem. She was a married woman after all, by placing the letters of her name in the first letter of the first line, the second letter of the second, the third of the third, the fourth, all the way down. It spells out her whole name, Frances Sargent Osgood. And people who don't want to go through that could get a cipher wheel. There's lots of different options for ways to encrypt messages. And Poe's not just interested in encryption, he was also interested in decrypting them. And that's where these articles come into play. People thought Poe was such a genius. He's invented the detective story. They started sending him ciphers to solve. And he just ended up solving every one of them, solved about 99 of them. One of them was a trick. It couldn't be solved. It was just a jumble of letters that didn't mean anything. And Poe proved it was just a meaningless jumble of letters. And he started doing so many of these that he got burned out on it. He said, I need more time to focus on my work, my real work, my poetry, my prose. So he turned the tables on his readers. He said, these are too impossible ciphers. They're so difficult. that I challenge you to figure out the encoded messages. He said they were sent to him by a guy named W.B. Tyler, which critics are pretty sure isn't a real person. They think that's Poe who came up with these messages. And, you know, if you solve them, you get a free subscription to the magazine. But years passed, nobody solved them. Decades passed, nobody solved them. Centuries passed. Nobody could solve these puzzles. And take a look at them. This is one of the messages, and this is the other. Just based on this, what do you think they say? Well, a few years after this, Poe decided to incorporate cryptograms into his fiction, and he wrote a story called The Gold Bug, which turned out to be his most popular short story during his lifetime. It was a huge hit. He got $100 for it. That's a year's rent. It was adapted into a stage play during Poe's lifetime. It's the story of an eccentric entomologist living on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, who finds a treasure map. It doesn't look like a treasure map. It looks all blank until he holds over a flame and reveals there's invisible ink, which is activated by the heat of the flame, but the message is all written in code. So he has to decode the cryptogram, and that gives him a series of even more cryptic clues he has to follow to find the buried treasure, which he does. And people were fascinated with this, including Robert Louis Stevenson, who said it inspired his story Treasure Island. But basically, this is the plot of the Da Vinci Code, National Treasure, and even the cinematic classic The Goonies. It all goes back to the Gold Bug. And it helped popularize the use of cryptograms in fiction. And the story had a much greater impact than just on other writers. It also inspired cryptographers. Over in England, an 8-year-old boy named Leo Marks read this story and was inspired to learn everything about cryptography. And he ended up being the leading British cryptographer during World War II. Back here on this side of the Atlantic, a kid named William F. Friedman loved the story so much that he grew up to become America's leading cryptologist. And it didn't stop there. Even one of the world's most popular board games started with somebody who was inspired by the Gold Bug. He loved that Poe's characters solved the code using frequency distribution, that he understood that certain letters appear more often in the English language than other letters. So who is this guy inspired by Poe? It is Alfred Butts, the inventor of Scrabble. So this story was very popular, had a wide-ranging impact, which is still felt today. But what about Poe's cryptograms here? Well, these unsolved messages just kind of got forgotten about. Occasionally people include them in anthologies, and oftentimes they would mix up the letters because they couldn't figure out what the message was. It wasn't until 150 years later that a Poe scholar, Terence Whalen, finally cracked the shorter of the two codes. And the words were all in order. They were just each spelled backwards. So this is what the code said. The soul secure in her existence smiles at the drawn dagger and defies its point. The stars shall fade away, the sun itself grow dim with age, and nature sink in years. But thou shalt flourish in immortal youth unhurt, mid the war of elements, the wreck of matter, and the crush of worlds. And it turns out that after all that time, Poe didn't write that. That's actually a quotation from Joseph Addison's play Cato. So the joke's on you. But what about the longer of the two messages? Does that have Poe's message for the future of humanity? Well, it took another decade to finally solve that. There was a new contest because the magazine didn't exist anymore. You couldn't get a free subscription to it now. And finally, Gil Broza, who was a software engineer in Toronto, was able to crack the second code. And he found that, of course, that there were multiple letters representing different letters. So that's part of why it was so difficult to solve. It had actually been incorrectly transcribed over the years in different anthologies, but he was able to figure out what it said. And this is Poe's message for humanity. Or is it? It starts out like this. It was early spring, warm and sultry glowed the afternoon. The very breezes seemed to share the delicious languor of universal nature, are laden the various and mingled perfumes of the rose and the esserine, the woodbine and its wildflower. They slowly wafted their fragrant offering to the open window where sat the lovers. The ardent sun shoot fell upon their blushing face, and its gentle beauty was more like the creation of romance or the fair inspiration of a dream than the actual reality on earth. Tenderly her lover gazed upon her as the clustrous ringlets were edged by amorous and sportive zephyrs, and when he perceived the rude intrusion of the sunlight, he sprang to draw the curtain, but softly she stayed him. No, no, dear Charles, she softly said, much rather you'd have I little sun than no air at all. So that's it. So that's Poe's message for the future? Nope, not this time either. It was a joke that had been published in a very similar wording the previous year in the Sporting Review. And it's kind of a racy joke for the time. There's these two lovers in bed, and the sun's coming in through the window, so the man wants to get up and close the curtain, and the woman says, no, stay back here in bed. I'd rather have a sun than no air. So it's playing on sun in the sky versus having a baby sun, and then air coming in through the window versus having an air or a sun. So that's the racy joke, the double entendre there. And people at Poe's time would have thought that was probably hilarious, but now we just read it and it just sort of falls a little bit flat. So did Poe mean anything like this? Did he think that, oh, this is going to be my message for humanity? Or did he just think, this would be a difficult one to solve? There's all these weird words. There's the letter Z in here. It's really going to throw people off. What do you think? Do you think that Poe is leaving us a message, or is it a joke on us? Does it really mean nothing at all? Let us know down in the comments what you think. And until next time, thanks for joining us. And as a reward for staying to the end, I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.